Now, this is my laborious introduction. Robert Bob Gott is an English teacher, which I think is central to a lot. It's a state of. It's a way of being, not an occupation. He is a bon vivant, I think is fair to say, is it not?
Sure.
I only recently discovered that Bob's an expert on fountain pens. This is a thing I didn't know, because I had a fountain pen that I thought was extremely flashy and expensive, and Bob just kind of disavowed me of that. It turns out it's worth $20. And he's a very, very accomplished artist. He is the creator, the inventor of Naked Man, which was a long-running series in the Sunday Age.
No, the Friday Age.
Friday Age, was it?
It was the Melbourne's weekly dick joke.
And he is the author of something like 100 books. Is that true?
No.
You're going to say it's 98, aren't you?
No, I'm going to say it's 110. They're mostly non-fiction, and you would not be interested in reading them. They are books for school children. In the old days, when children used to go to school libraries and borrow books to write projects, they don't do that anymore. And school libraries are now, if there are any school librarians here, you can confirm this, I think, they are de-booking libraries, and they're just putting in computers. And so if a kid's going to do a project on Indonesia, they just Wikipedia it. Once upon a time, they'd go to a fabulous book that I'd written about Indonesia and rip that off. But not anymore.
Did you write a book about Tina Arena?
I did. I wrote the first biography of Tina Arena in a white, clean cover. It wasn't. It was very hagiographic. It wasn't about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was just a celebration of her career.
Okay.
For kids.
Sure. Yeah. So a detailed analysis would have been really
inappropriate.
Fairly unfair, wouldn't it?
Inappropriate.
But relevantly for today's purposes, there are 4 Willpower Mysteries, which are more of a... We were talking about fiascos before. Are they a fiasco?
They're kind of black comedies,
yeah.
I would say. And their main character is an actor whose name is Willpower. And I named him Willpower because I used to teach a kid his name was actually, I think, Will something else, and he changed it to Willpower. And he was the most brilliant student. He was a lovely person. He became a doctor.
I used to work with a lawyer called Will Summons.
That's good.
Isn't that great? Anyway.
That's called nominative determinism.
Yes, like that dentist called Dr. Pullen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even more relevantly, you are the author of the 4 Murders books, and we are talking about the 4th.
Yep.
These started with Holiday Murders?
The Holiday Murders.
And that was 2013, I think.
Yep.
Yeah, and so we're now up to the 4th in the series.
Yep.
The final in the series?
No.
Good.
No.
Good. I'm so glad to hear that. The other way I think I often introduce Bob is that he is the writer's writer. There is so much about the way Bob operates that to other writers sort of generates this sigh of, oh, that's just how the world should be. He writes longhand in notebooks, in beautiful moleskin notebooks that he sometimes loses in taxis. He writes in a linear fashion, tell me if I'm wrong here, from one end of the story to the other.
Yes.
He writes in blocks of 8,000 words because he knows that's what fills the notebook. And when he's finished the 8,000 words of gorgeous longhand without a single error, he transcribes it into the computer, and that's the one edit that it gets. And then eventually he'll finish an entire manuscript and it goes off to the editor.
If only that were as true as you make it sound.
Hey, I write fiction. You write fiction. And also I think the other thing worth mentioning by way of introduction is that you do have something of a special relationship with our town.
I love Port Fairy.
You're a bit like sort of Ian Rankin in Edinburgh, aren't you?
I absolutely love Port Fairy.
Yeah.
And I didn't know Port Fairy at all until many years ago. I came here for the first time to do a pelagic bird watching expedition out into the Southern Ocean, which I don't know if you can still do it from here. Maybe you can. You book a boat with a lot of other bird nerds and go out into the Southern Ocean for 8 or 10 hours and watch birds out there. And that was probably the first time I really got to know Port Fairy. That was many years ago now. And if no one's done that, you should do that. You should totally do that. It is so magical. When you go out into the Southern Ocean, we'll get back to the book, but when you go out into the Southern Ocean, it is just incredible that there is nothing around. It is like a watery wilderness. There is nothing. And then you put a little bit of what's called burley, which are just fish guts, behind the boat. And then out of nowhere, within 10 or 15 minutes, there will be dozens and dozens and dozens of seabirds which have just materialized out of nowhere. And they'll sit behind the boat and eat the fish guts. And there's lots of species of albatross and prions and skewers. It's just the most magical thing.
Prions?
Yeah, a prion is just a seabird.
Good.
It's not just a seabird.
Again, you set me straight. I thought they were prions. They're prions.
Well, I say prion, so that's probably correct.
I'm trying to move you onto weaker ground, but there isn't any. Orchard Murders came out in August.
Yep.
And owing to all of the things that have afflicted all of us over these months, it didn't get a lot of attention when it came out. And
no, 3 launches were cancelled. But that happened to so many writers. I can't claim that as a tragic thing that happened to me and me alone. It happened to every writer who had a book out in 2021.
The thing that I noticed first, you very helpfully included a recap of the Murders series in the front of the book.
Yeah.
And I hadn't noticed that all of the action that you talk about across the 4 books takes place within a little over a year.
Yeah.
Which is sort of early 1943 to 1944.
1944. Yeah.
I think I had assumed for some reason that it was stretched out over wartime Melbourne, but it's...
I don't want to run out of war, Jock.
You are?
I am. I'm running out of war. Yeah.
One of the most distinctive things about these novels is their beautiful covers.
Yeah.
So they all match on the spine and they're fascinating to look at. Can you tell us a bit about who the artist is and how all that happened?
The artist who does these covers, or the book designer who does these covers, is a bloke called John Gray, and he's an English book designer. And just serendipitously for me, he is a very good friend of my publisher's daughter, who is also a book designer. There's no way that my publisher could afford John Gray. He designs covers for Zadie Smith and Martin Amis and Jonathan Safran Foer, all of those bods. But because he's a mate of Miriam's, he designs my covers, and it's an astonishing privilege. And they're so beautiful.
They are. And they're beautiful as a set, the 4 of them.
Yeah.
So I thought that was worth talking about. But can you perhaps take us through, by the time we get to the 4th book, these characters are well developed now and long familiar.
Yep.
But can you take us through the general story of the 4 books
Yeah,
and who
sure.
these people are?
All of these books are, they begin in the Melbourne Homicide Department, which only became a discrete unit in 1943. Prior to that, they did, work on homicides, but it didn't become a discrete unit separate unto itself until 1943. And so I've set the novel in that very early iteration of the Melbourne Homicide Department, and I've created a character called Titus Lambert, who's the head of that department. And unusually for crime novels, I think he is very happily married. Because I don't know about you, but I get tired of reading novels where the policeman or the detective is an alcoholic or he's got some sort of trauma that he has to work through. I thought, why can't people have a happy marriage? My parents had a happy marriage. That can't be unique. And so I thought, I'll create a happy marriage. And he needs his wife to help him because his wife is much smarter than he is. And I also wanted to introduce the idea of women in the Melbourne police force. Now, in the 1940s, there were only a handful of fully qualified police officers in Victoria. I think there were maybe 5. And they were they didn't have to wear, this is extraordinary, but they did not have to wear uniforms because the police commissioner at the time did not believe that they would ever rise above the post of constable. So they wouldn't need a uniform that required an extra bar on the shoulders. So they just wore civvies. But I introduced a character who is brought into this would never have happened in real life. This is the meaning of fiction. This head of the homicide department seconds this woman into the homicide department because it's a very truncated department because of World War II. A lot of those policemen went off to the war. So numbers were down. It would never have happened in real life. And also in this department is a young Jewish police officer whose name is Joe Sable. And he's a continuing character as well. And also, he would not have been elevated to that position either at his age, because he's only, I can't remember what his age is.
Is he sort of
28?
22? 28?
Or 20, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't remember.
A lot of the action in this novel is centred around Nutawading.
Yes.
And what I found fascinating is that it appears to be not quite rural, but it's very much the edge of Melbourne at this point.
Oh, Nutawading, well, even closer in, I don't know if you know Melbourne, but even closer in, they were orchards. Yeah. All the way up, I think, maybe even to close to Box Hill, maybe. Yeah. They were orchards as far as the eye could see. And certainly in Nutawading in 1943, it was orchard territory. So I've said it there.
And you seem to have launched off from a real historical incident, which was the Nutawading Messiah.
This is incredible. I came across this bloke accidentally many, many years ago. In 1870, in Nutawading, there was this man who decided that he was the Messiah. And he just announced that he was the Messiah. And because people are really stupid, a lot of them believed him. And they began following him and giving him money. And he kind of created his own cult, his own religion with hundreds and hundreds of followers who believed that he was the Nutawading Messiah. And his thing was that if you believed him, you would be immortal. And he didn't mean immortal post-mortem. He meant immortal. And as his followers started to die, as people did in the 1870s, he would say, this is evidence that they didn't believe enough in me, and they didn't give me enough money. A chap took him to court because he felt ripped off. He realised in a blinding moment of clarity that this man was not the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. He was just a charcoal burner who declared himself to be God. He took him to court to get some money back, and the judge said, if you are stupid enough to give this man money, I am not finding in your favour. So he didn't get his money back. And then I thought, what if this was set in the 1940s and the Nutawading Messiah, someone caught on to this and decided that he would start his own religion out in Nutawading, and that's the core thing. That's the core thing behind this, and it starts with an extremely unpleasant kind of mass murder.
Oh, I was going to come to that. Yeah. Oh. But to take that bizarre incident from 1870 and to transpose it into 1944, it still looks sort of comedic and implausible until you think about QAnon, and people will believe the most amazing things, even now.
I read in The Guardian today that in America, Republicans have a greater negative response to Biden than they do to Putin.
Quite incredible.
It's incredible. So it's entirely believable. And I think, I can never remember whether it was Voltaire or Rousseau. I think it was Voltaire who said that if you can convince people to believe in absurdity, you can convince them to commit an atrocity. And, that's pretty much the history of religion.
I want to come back to religion too, but one of the running gags in this novel is about how this guy is a cut-price Messiah.
Yeah.
And people keep observing, gee, he's got terrible teeth for the Messiah.
Yeah.
Or would the Messiah really wear that?
Yeah, why would the Messiah be that short?
Which I loved. But yes, it is an incredibly gruesome opening, and it follows on from the previous book, The Autumn Murders, which was also an incredibly gruesome opening. If you haven't read it, a man deliberately disfigures his face with a filleting knife in the shallows at Childer's Cove. And it makes for particularly difficult reading, as does this opening, Bob Gott.
Thank you.
We all have our processes, but do you start with a hideous image and decide to build a story around it?
No. No. The reason this starts with the Orchard Murder starts with a hideous image is because it is actually based on a real murder that happened in Western Australia in the 1930s on a farm. And all of the things that are present in the opening of this novel actually happened in this case in Western Australia.
Really?
And I fictionalised it up a little bit and transposed it, but I had to tone it down because the real murder is so astonishingly hideous that it just simply would not work as fiction.
Wow, okay.
So I took some of the worst parts. You may think that's unbelievable, but I did take some of the worst aspects of that murder out in order to make it more credible.
Did the Western Australian murder have the detail that one of the killings was not contemporaneous?
No.
Right.
Oh, yes, it did.
It did?
Yes. Yeah.
Right, because that's interesting. I don't think I'm spoiling anything
No,
in saying this,
no,
am I? But
no.
there are, 4 bodies?
Yes.
And one person has been murdered at a different point in time to the other 3, which is quite important to how it's investigated.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the corpses is a baby. Oh, yes. Trigger warning.
And one of the deaths is a man sitting in the thunderbox with a stick of gelignite in his mouth.
Yes. That was a suicide.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah.
That actually happened in the real murder case.
Did it?
And what was astonishing was that this guy who committed these murders was holding in his lap his dead son, who was 2 months old, and he put the stick of gelignite in his mouth and he lit it and he blew himself up. And astonishingly, the top half of him went away and the baby was fine. I mean, the baby was dead, but it wasn't. It's astonishing. I don't know the ballistics of gelignite. I'm just telling you what happened.
Hobbies. You need to take up some other sport entirely. Your language here and in everything of yours that I've read is very, very distinctive, and indeed just so elegant. But you have your pet peeves about language.
I do.
We've talked about before.
Yeah.
Can you what is it that you really
I have a
despise?
major problem with many modern writers, even close friends of mine. There is this fetish in modern writing, and I blame editors for this partly. People have stopped using verbs. They just have sentence fragments, and they take all the verbs out. And so there'll be a sentence, and then just this, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but there'll be a sentence that might go for quite a while, and there's no verb.
You had an example about a dog, I remember.
Yeah, and I just hate that. And I know that it started with Charles Dickens because Dickens used to do it. And I understand the effect that it can have. So if you have a very long sentence and you have a short, sharp, no verb sentence, it creates a kind of staccato effect. It creates a particular rhythm. But modern writers, they will just do it 5 or 6 times a page, and I find it's very difficult to read, and it just annoys me incredibly. Cormac McCarthy, terrible at this. He does this. I like Cormac McCarthy, but I get really annoyed
Are you, in writing the way you do, and you're quite distinctive among Australian writers, are you fighting a rearguard action against this, or is it a lost cause?
It's a lost cause because illiteracy is a contagion.
Spoken like an English teacher.
Even among writers, really good writers. I don't object to it if it's just one per page is fine, but not just a whole series of fragments of sentences. And the problem with it is that I think that a writer's voice is contained and focused in the verb in a sentence. And if you take the verb out, I would defy anyone to be able to pick a particular writer's voice from these sentence fragments. If you lined them up one against the other, I don't think you would be able to say, this is Cormac McCarthy, this is, I don't want to name people I know, but whoever. Because when you take the verb out, everything sounds the same. So there's a kind of generic quality to sentence fragments, there's a kind of banality to them, and the voice is ripped out of the novel, in my humble opinion.
So there's a verb in this book that is a perfectly ordinary verb that you've used in a highly specialised way, and that verb is depending.
Depending, yes.
Can you explain why that was such an issue in the edit?
Yeah, that is interesting. It's because even editors, even well-versed editors, sometimes don't know what words mean. It's not their fault. They went to the wrong school. No, that's not true. But I think my problem is that I'm a big fan of the 19th century. So I think I write sentences that will be more comfortable in 1870. The word depending, now, I describe a figure who is hanging from a beam, and I use the word depending. And because depending means hanging. If something is depending from a railing or from a beam, it is hanging.
Like a pendant light.
Like a pendant light. But the word depending actually means hanging. But I had to fight for that in this novel because my editor said, no one will know what that means and it sounds strange.
Or is it and I don't know what the form is, but the word after it, this was depending from, and were they aiming for depending on, because that's the more customary usage?
No, I think that the editor just thought I'd used the wrong word and did not know that depending meant hanging from. And I understand that. It's an unusual usage, certainly, but I'm terribly old-fashioned.
I should take you into the plot of this, and one of the features of Autumn Murders and this book is the detective agency Helen Lord and Associates, who you say early in this book could run at a loss for approximately 30 years. Mm-hmm. Can you explain who these people are and what they're up to?
Well, Helen Lord, who was the woman who was promoted to the homicide department, the men in the homicide department can't tolerate that she's there, so she has to leave. And she sets up her own agency because she is the niece of a very wealthy Melbourne businessman who, in one of the books, dies in unfortunate circumstances, and she simply inherits, his money. So she's able to set up her own agency.
Oh, do you know the good thing? I just realised the thing I was going to ask you too, when we were talking about depending and words, is we were having a chat down the back before about some of the vocab in this book.
Yep.
And how astonishing it is. This is the audience participation part of the afternoon. I'm going to run a few words past you, and you don't have to define the word, but I'd like you to just put your hand up if you're confident that you know what it means.
Please put your hand up.
Here we go. All of these words do appear in this story in an entirely unself-conscious fashion. First one, lubricious. That's drawn a complete blank.
Oh, come on.
Really? Okay, can you define it for us?
Oh,
You can't.
I can. I can. Lubricious means slightly sleazy, slightly, louche. Slightly louche, sleazy.
Okay, that was the easy one.
A bit creepy. Yeah.
Gallimorphry.
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 Look at that. A room full of well-read people.
Yeah, you need context.
I didn't highlight. That's cheating.
A gallimorphry just means a kind of a muddle of stuff.
Okay.
Star Wars?
Sorry?
Is it archaic?
No,
In my view, yes. Yes.
I don't think it's archaic.
Of course you don't.
I don't think it's archaic, but English is my first language.
Okay. Wither snake.
Wither snake.
Anyone know what a wither snake is?
I understand if you don't know what wither snake is, because that's a highly specific kind of
Something you found in the Bible.
biblical. Yeah, a biblical term for someone who's just a traitor.
Okay, we'll go back to doing an easy one. Truculence. Yeah. Oh, there you go. There's a bit of confidence there. Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
Good.
Okay. Let's take this offshore. Gaijin. You do.
Yeah, thank
Yes,
you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, some recognition. Now, domain, but spelt Demesne. Ah,
Yeah.
righto. Okay.
Yeah.
Most people consider that highly archaic.
Thank you. Lucy.
Well,
Thank you. Okay, I've got one more, and I'm going to put serious money on this clean bowling the entire room. Gewgaws. Look at that.
No, come on. If you have in your house on a shelf or in a corner a gewgaw,
What's that?
G-E-E-G-A-W.
G-E-W?
G-W-G-A-W. Gewgaw. Yeah, and what is a gewgaw?
what?
What is a gewgaw?
Ornament.
Yes, exactly. It's a kind of an ugly ornament.
Useless ornament.
Yeah,
That word is a useless ornament. Yes. Yes, it is. Right.
It's a thingamajig. Yeah.
I feel vindicated now.
Well,
The Irish is sounding well.
gallimorphry.
Gallimorphry?
Gallimorphry, if you have... gallimorphry just means a random mixture of things. So you could have a gallimorphry of lollies, if they're all mixed up, or you could have a gallimorphry of books. It just means a muddle or a big bundle of stuff which is unrelated one to another. It's just a gallimorphry, for example.
Okay, back to plotty things, having had that little excursion.
Yes.
There have been in each of these books, but there are particularly here a cast of what I would call broken young men. There's Joe Sable.
Yep.
There's Tom Mackenzie.
Yep.
Guy Kirkham and the wonderfully named Winslow Fazakerley.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's a product of the times you're writing about, that the world was full of broken young men, or is that just a thing that works in this story?
No, I think it was a time of broken young men. Because they all have had some kind of experience in World War II. Joe Sable, who's one of the lead characters, is a non-religious Jew who lived in Carlton, and he has no connection to his Jewish faith or even his Jewish culture at all, until he starts to read in newspapers what's happening in Europe. What was astonishing in World War II was that what Hitler was doing to the Jews in Germany was actually reported here. Never on the front page, but it was reported. And I use Joe Sable as a way of examining how it is that as a country, we came to believe that we only knew about the Holocaust after the war was over. Because if you ask anybody, when did Australia learn about the truth of the Holocaust? People will say, well, at the end of the war, when the camps were liberated. But in fact, they were fairly well recorded from about 1942 on. But we had this moment of amnesia where we simply forgot that there was a lot of competition, admittedly, because of Japan and what was going on in the Pacific War. But still, it just fascinates me how that happened. And what was also fascinating was that at the end of the war, in 1945, when the camps were finally liberated, they started publishing photographs in the Argus and the Age and Australia Post. The photographs that would never be published in any newspaper today. They were astonishingly graphic, horrific photographs. But what was so interesting about those was that before the photographs were published, when the atrocities were being reported, they were always reported as these things were happening to the Jews. There was a massacre of Jews. There was the camp at Auschwitz was described in one newspaper, and it was clear that it was about the Jews. That article is fascinating because the person who wrote it hadn't realised what was going on with Zyklon B, which is the gas which they used to gas the Jews. And so this person, who was an eyewitness, believed that they were using condensed steam to kill people because he didn't know about Zyklon B. And that was reported in the Argus and the Age. And it was always quite clear what Hitler's program was. It was about the elimination of the Jews. But when the photographs started to appear, which were really horrific of the liberation of the camps, underneath the photographs, it said piles of dead prisoners, dead bodies, corpses. Not one photograph identified that these bodies were of Jewish people. Not one. And I still don't understand really what that was about.
So I imagine the arguments would be it could be a product of the media ownership at the time, or is it
Possibly.
a product of the audience, what they want to read?
I think it was partly a product of Australia's long-standing horror of refugees, and the idea that if you identify these people as Jews, they're all going to want to come here. All the survivors are going to want to come here. It's like the policy of this government with refugees. You don't want to see them and you don't want to name them. You want to keep them as anonymous as possible, because as soon as you identify them, name them, photograph them, show us them, they become people instead of just statistics.
Yeah.
And that seemed to be the enterprise, but I don't really know. I don't want to believe that it was a kind of endemic, profound and horrifying anti-Semitism in Australia, but that's got to be in the mix, I think.
On that note, I said we'd circle back to religion. Orchard Murders is substantially about religion in lots of different ways, isn't it?
Yep.
And you constantly exhibit, as well as this extraordinary vocab, you exhibit this deep understanding of the weird bits of the Bible.
Yes, I love the weird bits of the Bible.
And the weird bits of Catholicism.
So
we're sort of circling into Deuteronomy and Leviticus here,
Yes.
I think, aren't we? Is it possible that you're playing out, through all of these characters, some of your scepticism about organised religion?
it's not just possible, it's highly probable.
I mean, what's the rub here? What have you got against all these people?
Well, clearly you weren't educated by the Christian Brothers, Jock. You were educated by the Jesuits.
I was.
Yes.
But I didn't write a novel about
No,
religion.
I'm fascinated by the way the things that people will buy. Now, I am not against organised religion as such. I think that if people want the consolation of religion, I completely understand that, because it makes sense. It makes a kind of sense. And I only have a problem with it when that spills over into this absurd belief that what I believe, you must believe. And if you don't believe what I believe, well, I'll kill you. Where are we going with this?
Well, you were talking before about how you decided to subvert the genre by having a happy marriage in this book. It is the case in here, isn't it, that all of the fools are religious?
Yes.
Except for one or two master manipulators.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if that's a question.
For people who believe, I I admit that I'm a very judgy person. And I admit that I have a very strong prejudice against creationists, for example, because I simply cannot believe or don't want to believe that people will buy this stuff. But they do. And so I am interested in why they do. Why would you buy into that? It makes no sense. Why would you buy in to the literal truth of the Bible, for example, if you can't explain Leviticus and Deuteronomy, the two most inconvenient books of the Old Testament, because they are the books of the law. And the books of the law are astonishingly weird in the modern era. They're astonishingly weird. Did you know that if you are short-sighted, you may not approach the altar of the Lord? You. All these people. You may not. And if you are a man and you have the misfortune to lose a testicle to cancer or in war, I'm sorry, but you are damned. You are damned. And if you are a woman who is raped, if the woman is raped in a town, then she will be taken outside the town and stoned to death, because she should have cried out louder than she did in order to be rescued. This just blows my mind that,
so we're back
that
to
literalists of the Bible buy into this and seem to think, yeah, I can accept that.
And that's the Voltaire thing you were talking about
Yeah.
absurdity and atrocity, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
There are two great moral quandaries that you've set up in this story. One is early on, Titus arrests this pretty feeble-minded
Yeah.
guy called Wilson for the murders,
Yes.
even though he's got a very strong hunch that he's probably not the guy.
No.
And for most of the book, he wrestles with the dilemma of having done that. And it seems that practically he had to arrest somebody at the time.
To prevent panic
Yes.
in the community.
Yeah. And then the other one is Tom befriending and spying on Fazakerly.
Yeah. There's a character, I also wanted to introduce in this book a bit of Japan, because the first three books are very German-centric in a way. Because there were in Australia in the 1940s proper, not neo-Nazis, Nazis, who absolutely believed in National Socialism. Now, they were always fringe in Australia, but they were definitely there. And in this book, I wanted to look at what happened to Japanese Australians who were all interned during the war. So I introduced a character who is married to a Japanese woman, and he's immediately suspect of being a Japanese spy.
But Tom meets him and likes him,
Yeah.
and thinks this is an interesting, intelligent person who could be my friend, and
Yep.
spends time with him, but at the same time, his job is to spy on him and
Yep.
ultimately, indirectly, to denounce him.
Yeah, because that's what if you work in intelligence, that's what you do. I'm interested in people who work in intelligence because their moral compass must just spin out of control frequently, even now.
I think isn't there a recent bio of Philby that makes exactly that point, that all the way to the grave he was trying to justify
Yeah,
people he'd betrayed. And
yeah.
were there, you said about there being proper Nazis in Australia, were there genuine adherents of Hirohito, like this
Yes.
Clive?
Yes.
Who was Clive? The Clive in there who's...
Yeah,
there
there were. Yeah. In Western Australia, there was a chap called, his surname was Bullock. I can't remember his first name. But he put out leaflets inviting the Empire of Japan to come into Australia and take over the Australian government. And there were a group of Australian, very right-wing, white Australians who were all in favour of Japan taking over the Australian government. It's hard to believe, but they were nutters. But because they had the capacity to publish stuff,
Yep.
they had little groups around.
Thank God
them.
they didn't have social media.
Well, if they had social media, they would be meeting, outside Parliament. And social media, oh my God.
I've taken the lid off this, haven't I? That's my fault.
Can you believe that they can, once upon a time, the anti-vaxxers and those nutters lived in caravans on the edge of town. And they had no contact one with another, except, in the next caravan. But with social media, suddenly they are able to coalesce into this hideous and really frightening group of, I don't know what you call a very large collection of morons. Is there a collective now?
There needs to be, yeah. Stand by for the next novel.
We should make one up. We should make one up. But social media has created the ability of people to find each other. Once upon a time in World War II, these people found each other, but only in kind of small, little disparate, unthreatening groups, in a way.
This novel, perhaps unlike the ones that precede it, there's a trail of carnage, which is what you do well.
Thank you.
And broken homes and corpses and all of these things. But it ends pretty well for everybody who's still alive.
Yes.
I don't know if I'm spoiling things here, but is that a fair assessment of what you've done?
That's what Oscar Wilde said. That is the meaning of fiction. The good end happily and the bad end unhappily. That is the meaning of fiction.
Or, I've already forgotten it, but what's the first line of Anna Karenina?
What is that? All happy families are alike. All unhappy families are different in their own way, or something like that.
Yes,
it's a word like that.
Yes.
But
I was thinking about this because of a line way towards the end of the book, and you don't actually attribute it, but I suspect it might be Clara, who says, "The world is full of knots. Bows are harder to come by."
Yeah.
I really like that. Did you lift that from somewhere? Did you come up with it?
No.
It's a nice idea.
It's a nice idea. I'm a nice guy.
The world is full of knots. Bows are harder to come by.
Yeah.
See, that's a little warm note there from you.
That makes up for the dead baby.
I am now turning this over to the room.
No, before you do.
Oh, yeah, why? What?
I want to take down Norman Lindsay.
Oh, Norman Lindsay. Yes, I'm sorry. I did promise Bob that we would talk about Norman Lindsay, which is a
Yes.
bit like talking about verbs or social media, but we have to let him go.
I don't know if you know very much about Norman Lindsay, but he was a 24-carat asshole. And there's a character in this book who ends up dead, and he's a big fan of Norman Lindsay. And Norman Lindsay has become, the reason I want to take him down is because he's become this kind of avuncular figure in Australian art who produces acceptable, soft, erotic representations.
Do you think Sirens was too kind to him?
Oh, absolutely. Sirens presented him as this soft,
And a bit of a player.
But his political opinions were absolutely appalling. He was a first-class misogynist. He believed that women were incapable of creative effort because the female mind was only half a mind. He also believed that homosexual men were incapable of... These are his words that he wrote in a book called Creative Effort. He says, "I cannot think of one true homosexual whose achievements have ever been of the order of greatness." I don't know how Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo feel about this, but You do, I think, get many scintillatingly clever homosexuals, but there is always an incompleteness about even their best work. It is always underlaid with what they themselves would call, I suppose, bitchiness. It just isn't the product of a male mind, but how could it be? It's half female. And this is his view of racial equality. The idea of racial equality is one of the greatest of mass imbecilities of the 20th century. That if you... miscegenation, which is the marriage of a white person with a person of colour, It lowers the standing of the white race without raising the level of the Negro, in this case, that's the word he uses, to the same level. And he has this to say about Jews. If the Jew had never existed, what might not mankind have gained? Norman. That's in a book called Creative Effort, which he wrote in, I think, 1910. But he never resiled from that. He never believed that women were capable of any kind of creativity at all. And bizarrely, he was both anti-German, because his brother was killed in World War I, and fiercely, ferociously anti-Semitic. He was also an atheist, but in a really unpleasant way. I mean, I'm an atheist, but I would never say this about, Jesus. He said Jesus had the gift of all lesser intellects. This Galilean artisan was typical of his race. He had the emotionalism of a suppressed people. He was able to stir up the mob to epileptic passion. At best, he was only half intelligent, a feminine mind.
There he is again.
Excited, suffering, and sentimental. Worst of all, this Jew imposed the belief that suffering ennobles. I don't like Norman Lindsay. He was, sorry?
How many times was that book published? Only once?
No, I think that numerous times, yeah. He is a great draftsman. You have to give him that. Especially his engravings, they're really seriously superb. They are superb. But his oil paintings are kind of ghastly. And his railing against, say, gay men, there's I can't remember who said it, but someone said that, a great antipathy often implies a secret affinity. And when you look at his oil paintings of women especially, there's nothing feminine, or I don't find them anything about them that's feminine or erotic. They're a bit like Michelangelo's paintings of nudes. They're very mannish. They're like these male bodies with very large breasts attached. And so I don't think you should stop. I don't want people to stop looking at his work. I despise the cancel culture, but just know going in.
Does this mean
that he's an arsehole?
Is your next work going to be a takedown of Norman? Is that where you're going with this?
Yeah.
I actually know a little bit about your next work, but can you tell us about
Oh, this isn't a takedown of Norman. Yeah, my next novel is a standalone novel. It's set now, and it's a satire on the Archibald Prize. And I have a politician who foolishly agrees to be painted nude for the Archibald Prize, and then he's made the education minister, and that's totes orcs, as the young people say. It'll be out early next year, in time for the Archibald Prize.
And it's very, very funny.
It's called Naked Ambition.
Yes, it's wonderful. I will hand over to you guys. Would anyone like to ask Bob a question while
Or Jock.
we've got him in town? Not me, but Bob. This is like the vocab test.
Bob, two things. Firstly, you made the comment in the previous visit here that the reason why you were writing, one of the reasons why you were writing in the 40s, is because the kind of language you could use is different to the language that you can use today. And how is that affecting your writing of the current book? And that's a question. My comment is whether the quotes that you've given us of Norman Lindsay go in some way to explaining the photographs that you talked about before of the liberation of Auschwitz and the fact that perhaps anti-Semitism in this country was far, far more prevalent than we really thought it was.
Yeah, that's a great question. In answer to the first one, I will guarantee that in the modern novel, every sentence will still have a verb. And as to the second thing, that's a really interesting, I haven't actually thought about that connection, but I think that anti-Semitism probably is endemic in this culture. And maybe you don't even have to scratch very hard to find it under the surface.
Just to make a comment, when at the end of the war, when there was this influx of refugees, Arthur Corwell made the point that we have to control the number of Jews because in terms of their reputed character, it is really the lowest of the low. And he said that quite openly.
Yeah.
Particularly Jews from Shanghai, because somehow they were even more tarnished.
Yeah. Yeah, we do forget that. But we also forget that the White Australia policy was not lifted until 1960-something, 67, 68?
Incredible.
Which is just mind-blowing to think that. Yeah, the first wave of Jewish refugees came in the 1920s and 30s. And then there was the threat of the second wave. But we have a disgraceful history of various kinds of prejudices.
It's all very small-minded.
Yes, it is.
The Jews, the black people,
Yep,
homosexuals, so small-minded.
it's so small-minded.
Yeah, that's true.
It is. It is so small-minded. And if you take any of those groups out of our culture, there's just this huge empty void of creativity. And education. Yeah. We're a very pockmarked culture, I think.
You're talking about the photographs that came out, how ghastly they were after the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
I always had the sense of a very short-lived sense of shame. We were so badly describing these people. We've seen what happened to them, and the backlash was a sense of shame that we cannot refer to these people as Jews, but prisoners.
I would like to think that was shame.
That's the sense
I don't think it
continued to get.
Yeah.
That
I-
short-lived sense of shame. We were so nasty to these people.
Yeah.
This is what happened to them, and now we can actually see.
I would love to think that you were right and that it was shame. I don't think it was shame. I think it was the opposite of shame. I think it was it's not just Australians, it's probably all of it, everyone, but we seem to be able to cope better with the anonymity of people who are the victims of atrocities rather than the actual, getting to know who they are, naming them. I don't think it was shame. I don't think we were ashamed of what... I don't think Australians could believe that this had anything to do with us in World War II. They made no connection between Auschwitz and Belsen and Buchenwald and all of those places and Australia. I don't think they made any connection at all. All that they represented was the potential threat that suddenly we're going to get flooded with a whole lot of whiny survivors who are going to come to Australia and just expect to settle here.
I always think the indication of that with the modern asylum seeker debate was the point at which we started allocating numbers to people.
Yep.
That there had been a very deliberate media strategy to make this about brown people in boats.
Yep.
And for God's sake, don't think of them as families and parents and children. And you could take that a step further by the legal justification, which is fair, is that if people were found not to be genuine and had to go home, then using their names in the media meant they were in danger.
Yep.
So the courts in particular, but also the media started switching in numbers instead of names. But it's also a dehumanising thing, isn't it? It's a way of not having to grapple with people's humanity. Makes it a bit easier to stomach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also, none of us is able to accommodate all of our heads would blow up if we were calibrated in some way to actually feel all of the things we should feel about these situations in the world, we would just burst into flames.
Yes. That's probably fair.
I remember as a small boy, being taken to meet a friend of my father's who was in the police force and going into Russell Street. This would have been in the early 50s, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
And taken to one room which was described as being where D24 was located.
Yep.
Which sort of backs up your idea of the statement about the small number of people in the investigative side of things at that stage. But the other memory I have in terms of what we're talking about is that my early introduction to Jews in Australia was a fear of their commercial acuity.
Oh yeah, the great fantasy that the world is run by an international conspiracy of Jewish bankers.
And that was a sort of notion that came to me first
Yeah,
as a child.
yeah. That's how ingrained it was. What is also interesting about the Victorian Police Force is that it was riven, not so much with anti-Semitism, but with anti-Catholicism. The conflict between the Catholics in the police force and the Masons in the police force often spilled over into violence inside the police headquarters in Russell Street. There were fights that broke out in the gymnasium between...
You had a scene in one of the earlier novels about this.
Yeah, it's based on a real event where Masons and Catholics they just hated each other. And you probably remember when you were growing up that Catholics and Protestants hated each other. You couldn't marry a Catholic, you couldn't marry a Protestant without damaging your family. Yeah.
Joe up the back there.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I'm just intrigued about the book, the murder mystery you wrote about Port Fairy. And visited Port Fairy and finding such a lovely village here as you did many years ago.
Yes.
What were the elements within this little environment that gave you the groundwork to create a murder mystery? What elements?
Oh right. Well, this is.
Why'd you pick on us?
This is the creepiest town in Australia. I have said this many times. I love Port Fairy, but you go outside after 9 o'clock, it's a spooky town. There is no one around. It's really dark. There's all of those Norfolk pines making all those soughing noises, or, you know, a good word would be susurration.
Oh. Care to define it, anyone? No?
But it's a really creepy town. It seriously is. You just know that there are ghosts wandering around the streets of this town. That's for sure. And I love that. I absolutely love it. And I don't feel threatened or anything here. It's just that after dark, it's spooky.
I was interested when you were talking about the caravans on the other edge of town.
Yeah.
And I can't believe how they could be anti-vax, etc.
Yeah.
I have been there. What I'm learning now, though, is that is why there was such a gap between us and between the anti-vaxxers and the other groups who are online.
Sure.
And I'm wondering if maybe we have to change where we're capable of changing and have to understand where they're coming from.
Well, it's really easy. Vaccination is an IQ test. I think. And so you're saying that we need to learn how to accommodate, understand. Well, yeah.
But then that comes through other way. Maybe our brains will blow up if we have to try and think too.
Yeah. I don't really want to get inside an anti-vaxxer's head because, no.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that was
I thought there was more.
That was
No,
a bit
there
of a downer.
I just have a reflection when I was a little girl and my mother was working in a nursing home and she'd take me there because nobody could look after me.
Yep.
And there was a gardener there, his name was Frank.
Yep.
my father loved the Japanese.
Yep.
Because he was in Shanghai and they treated the Jews, him being a Jew, a whole lot better than the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And because they didn't discriminate, they didn't even know who Jews were, so they didn't discriminate against them. So he taught me Japanese songs and that. So I was singing one of those songs to Frank, and Frank stopped and he said, "Don't you ever mention Japanese." I would have been about 5.
Yeah.
Japanese, the worst people, don't ever mention. So
Yeah.
I never said a word about Japanese again.
Yeah.
And so I just remember that palpable,
Yeah, it is amazing, isn't it, how each of us would have an incident in our own lives where something like that happened, and somehow each of us bring to society those small prejudices. And I think, well, growing up is about shedding prejudices. And I don't know if you keep a diary, but I keep a diary. And when I read my diary when I was 20, I think, why would anyone want to talk to that? Because when you're young, you're pretty horrible because you don't know stuff. Growing up is about learning to shed prejudices which other people give us.
But I think he would have been in Asia at that time. He would have been fighting Frank.
Sure.
And he might have lost friends. And
Yeah.
he might, so that, he had his own horror stories.
Yeah.
But this brings us back to the world is full of knots, bows are harder to come by.
That's right.
I'm conscious of the time. I think we'd better wrap things up if we can. But can I ask you again if you wouldn't mind taking part in our strange and unprecedented virtual signing event at the counter? That would be great for Bob and great for the shop. Bob, thanks heaps for coming.
Oh, you're welcome.
Are you going to come back and launch Naked Ambition when it comes out?
Oh, please, yes.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And thank you all for listening.
It will be a clothing optional event.
For you.